initially in Egypt, but overstayed their welcome by, 4 centuries. And by the end of all of that, they are enslaved to a Pharaoh who, of course, never knew Jacob or Joseph at all. Those are lost memories. So the people are enslaved and they're working 400 years. When we sometimes refer to the 400 silent years with reference to the Bible, usually we're talking about the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament as being 400 years. But the real 400 silent years probably is when they are in Egypt, where we don't hear anything of their story during all that time. But we pick up again in Exodus with them being slaves. Moses and Aaron are raised up by God. The Exodus, the Red Sea, the 10 Commandments, the wilderness wanderings. Okay, that's the big picture. So in thinking of this timeline, I have a question for you. Which comes first? Genesis 1 or the covenant that God made with them at Sinai? Okay. Seems pretty obvious, doesn't it? So what's the obvious answer? You can go ahead and talk out loud. What's the obvious answer? Yes, Genesis 1. Of course, it precedes the covenant made at Sinai. But there's a little bit of a twist as we think about this for a moment. Who wrote Genesis chapter 1? And presumably, it would have been Moses. Okay, do you think that Moses wrote the book of Genesis while he was growing up in Pharaoh's household in the first 40 years of his life? It's probably not when he wrote the book. Do you think it was during the 40 years when he became a goat herder for Midian? Probably not then either. It's probably after God commissions him at this burning bush to go back down into Egypt. And the people have been brought out, 10 plagues, crossing of the Red Sea. And now they go into Sinai and they meet with God at Sinai. And then because of some major screw-ups, they end up wandering around for 40 years. I'm guessing that the book of Genesis and the other books that we normally attribute to Moses as author were probably all written then during that 40 years of wandering. Okay? Killing time on the road. Right? Dad, when are we going to get there? 40 years of wandering around. That's probably when he's writing this story. Why is that important? Because these people are already under the covenant that was given at Sinai when Moses is writing the story about their origins. Okay? The God of creation is the God of the covenant. So we start off with the very first sentence, usually translated as, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Okay? I would prefer, I think I mentioned this last time, I would probably prefer to say, in the beginning God created the heavens and the land, because it's the same term that is used for the land that God promises to Abram and Isaac and Jacob and so forth. But at least in Genesis 1:1, it makes it sound like this is a comprehensive term. In the beginning, God created everything. I could talk some about the term in the beginning, but that goes a little bit beyond where I'm heading right now. Or God created the heavens and the land. Why is that important? Last night or last session, we looked at Deuteronomy 30, and he said, "This day I call heavens and the land as witnesses to this covenant." Now, which comes first, the covenant or Genesis 1? These people are already under a covenant. These people are already being held accountable for their behavior by the heavens and the land. So let me try and say this in more of a paraphrase way. In the beginning, God created the heavens, in the beginning, God created the covenant witnesses. That's how the whole story starts. This is all about relationship between people and God from the very first sentence of the Bible. Another way to think about this is that everything you see in all of creation has a designated purpose within our relationship with God as witnesses of God's faithfulness and, unfortunately, of human unfaithfulness or rebellion. Or to use the terms from last session, the central plot behind the whole Bible is what happens when an irresistible force meets an immovable God. What happens when God's desire to bless meets human rebellion? There are witnesses who are observing the whole story unfold. And they're the first thing that God pays attention to in the text of Genesis 1:1. Okay, I'm starting off kind of deep and heavy here, but any questions or thoughts or rowdy amens or anything that you'd like to add here? Okay, good, I got the amen. Any other questions? Okay. So multiple times in the book of Deuteronomy, we find the heavens and the land being identified as these witnesses. Deuteronomy chapter 4 says, "I call heavens and the land, or earth, as witnesses against you this day." Chapter 30, "This day I call heaven and the land as witnesses against you." 31:28, "I call heaven and the lands to testify against them." And in 32 verse 1, we read, "Listen, O heavens, I will speak. Hear, O land, the words of my mouth." Who is God talking to? The covenant witnesses. Okay, so in our first session, I mentioned that this was narrative, and I said, what's the setting? And the setting was the heavens and the land. But now it turns out that the setting is not just a static place. It's actually a character, a couple of characters, who are brought into the plot line of the whole Bible. So if you were to look up on a word search the word land, for instance, you will find it literally hundreds of times in the Bible. The first thing that God does is he makes all of creation. They stand in the service as being witnesses to this covenant. Or let me say it again. The God of creation is the God of covenant. The God of covenant is not just some local or national God. He is the God over everything. All right. Now here I have all of chapter 1 on one slide. Okay? I'll give you just a moment to read through that. Now, I realize the font is way, way, way too small. But I do have some words there highlighted in red. And it's always the same phrase. And God said, 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 and God said. So how many times do we have the phrase, and God said? I think it probably, if we were to take just a wild guess, we would probably go with 7, because there's 7 days of creation. But it's not 7. It's actually 10. 10 times we have, and God said. Why is that significant? Because there's 10 different speakings by God. Which came first? Genesis 1 or the covenant at Sinai? The covenant at Sinai. Why would 10 words, 10 speakings be significant to people who are already under the covenant? Again, you can participate here. Why is that important? What's that? Is it because of the 10 Commandments? Bingo. You can even move up another roll if you'd like for that. Yes. In fact, we call them the 10 Commandments in Jewish history of interpretation. They have always referred to what we call the 10 Commandments as the 10 words, the 10 speakings, the 10 sayings. So what we have here is the same God who formed a relationship with these people, beginning with these 10 speakings, actually created everything that exists in 10 speakings. The God of creation is the God of covenant. The God of covenant is the one who's responsible for everything. He's the God of creation. Okay, those are not the only 2 tens that we encounter in the first 5 books of the Bible. So last night there was some kind of question about significant numbers. 3 and 7 and 12 and 40. Those would all be significant numbers in the Bible. But now here's maybe another one to add to that list, the number 10. So we have 10 times God says, we read in the text, and God said. Okay. There are also 10 generations. In Genesis 5, is a whole book of genealogy, or a whole chapter of genealogy. There are 10 generations from Adam down to Noah, most of whom we've never even heard of outside of that genealogy. Only one of them do we even really recognize, and that would probably be Enoch. In Genesis 14, there's this kind of funny story about 5 kings who ride off into battle against 4 kings. And they wage this battle in a place that, I think my NIV calls it tar pits. But the Hebrew there is actually kind of a funny expression. It's pity pits. I mean, if you fall in a pit, that's bad. But if you fall in a pity pit, oh man, you don't need a long ladder to get out, right? So there's this war that takes place between the 5 on 4, and then at the end of this story, Abram is one of the ones who actually comes alongside in this alliance. But there's another king who shows up who didn't participate in the battle at all. He is actually the king of Salem, which is to be associated with Jerusalem. But it's also related to the word for peace, shalom. So there's one non-combatant king who is the king of Shalom, Salem. And his name, any guesses here? Melchizedek, whose name means king of righteousness. And there's no real explanation given here. But when Abram sees Melchizedek, he ends up tithing to him, giving him 10% of everything that he has. And Melchizedek ends up blessing Abram. Now, the blesser is always one who has greater power than the blessee. So here is someone even greater than Abram, who's only around for a few verses. Abram acknowledges his very important role, and then he's gone. Here's another little aside for you here. We always have to have a perfunctory allusion to Tolkien somewhere in speaking, right? Have any of you read the books, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, all right? Because this is something that doesn't come out in the movies at all. I don't know how Peter Jackson jumped over this, but Tom Bombadil, he's got to be one of the coolest characters, and he never makes it into the movie. Who's Tom Bombadil? Tom Bombadil is this other kind of he looks like a person, but he doesn't seem to be affected by things the way anybody else is. He can take that one ring to rule them all and put it on, and nothing happens. He is so much more powerful than Sauron, or than any of the other characters that you encounter there. Not even Gandalf could put on a ring like that, right? I've always scratched my head and wondered what J.R.R. Tolkien was doing in introducing that kind of a character. But I use that story only to say that however much I feel that with Tom Bombadil, I feel it even more with Melchizedek. Who was that guy? And we're given a little bit more of a clue, actually, in the book of Psalms, where a coming king is prophesied who will be a priest king like Melchizedek. All right. So we're given a bit of clarification there. But it's really not until the book of Hebrews that all of this becomes clear. And Hebrews devotes several chapters to showing how Jesus is not a priest like all the priests from the tribe of Levi. He's a priest like he's a priest like Melchizedek. And that's where we get the fullest parallel in between those characters. All right, so in Genesis 14 we have 10 kings. The 4 plus the 5 plus the 1. Right? In Genesis 22 we have the story of the binding of Isaac, or the almost sacrifice of Isaac. And I bring this up because the word son, and this is even true in your English Bibles, your translations, so you can see this. But in that story, the name, or the word son, S-O-N, appears 10 times. 10 brothers go down into Egypt. It's not the whole 12, because Joseph is already down there. And Benjamin is left behind because he's now the favorite kid of Dad, Jacob, who doesn't want to let Benjamin go that far. So 10 brothers are sent down into Egypt. There are 10 plagues on the Egyptians. There are the 10 words, the 10 speakings at Sinai. The tabernacle is made up of 10 different curtains. The covenant, the word covenant, is found 10 times in the book of Leviticus. In Leviticus, in the first 7 chapters, there are 5 sacrifices that are talked about. And you read about each of these 5, and then it goes back and it repeats those same 5 sacrifices again. Why didn't they just all combine it into the guidelines altogether? I don't know, but you end up with a total of 10. There in Leviticus 27, which is the last chapter of the book of Leviticus, it's about things that are dedicated to God, and there are 10 of these dedications. And in the book of Numbers, the people end up defying God 10 times. So it looks like this one author, if we're going with Moses here, this one author is seeing all kinds of connections. Not that he invented those connections. He merely, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, drew our attention to these patterns of 10 that God already built into the historical accounts. Okay? Questions or thoughts at this point? Okay. In verse 24 of chapter 1 in Genesis, we read, "And God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark the seasons and days and years." And nearly all English translations go with the word seasons. So what do we think of when we read the word seasons? Naturally, our minds just kind of go to spring, summer, fall, winter. Tamara? Oh, okay. All right. Correction. Need to fix that slide. It should be 114 rather than 124. Any other questions? No, that's fine. It says to mark seasons. We tend to think of the 4 seasons. I don't even know if you really think in terms of seasons here in Hawaii in the same way. Paula? Not really so much. Well, the curious thing about this word for seasons is that it appears a bunch of times in the Bible. 242 times in the Old Testament, this word, moed or moedim, it appears in the Bible. And there's only 2 places in the whole Bible where it is ever very consistently translated as seasons. One of them is in 114 of Genesis, and the other one is in Psalm, I think it's 109. And even there, I think it's arguable whether or not it should be translated that way. So how does it get translated all the other times? It's 104, Psalm 104. As appointments, namely the Sabbath and other feasts and holy days. Everett Fox, the Jewish scholar, Bible translator, translates this as signs for set times. The NIV, the 2011 version of it, has sacred times. And it's the first major English translation that I've seen that I think really captures what's going on here. The sun, the moon, and the stars serve as signs to mark What season it is, winter, summer, is to mark special holy days every seventh day. The feasts, like the Day of Atonement or the Feast of Tabernacles. That's the term that is used all the way through the whole Pentateuch, but gets lost a little bit in our English translations. Now, I want to say something, and I think it's important to do so at this point. I don't think that all of you need to know Hebrew and Greek. The translations that you have in your hand have been put together by people who really knew what they were doing when they were making translations. But they're not infallible. It does help to look at several different translations to see how they're all rendering a particular phrase. And at least in this case now, with the 2011 New International Version, we see that they're taking this in a very different direction. And I do think that it is the correct direction. All right, what's the significance of this? Which comes first? Genesis 1 or the covenant at Sinai? Which comes first? The text that says that God rested on the seventh day, or the covenant in which you read, observe the Sabbath? And the covenant to observe the Sabbath comes first. And then we have the backstory, and we realize, look, even God took a day off. You guys can do this. You guys should do this. All right? So, what we see here is that the God of creation, in 6 days plus the day of rest, is the God of the covenant, where he enjoins all of his creation to enter into Sabbath as well. Okay, these are some pretty big and I think pretty exciting things. Agreed? Okay, any thoughts or questions? Tamer? Hang on a second, Zach's on his way.
I just instantly think of the Christmas star, the light, to mark the appointed time. The time, the light, it came.
Yes.
I mean, way back at creation, God knew he was going to have to send Jesus to fix the sin that we brought.
Right.
Before sin had even occurred.
Yeah. This to me is a mind-blowing concept as well. I mean, the Magi followed a star. The star was pointing them to an appointment. Or let me put this in maybe a little more common way for us to understand. God placed the sun and the moon and the stars in place so that we would know what time it is. Do you realize that your smartphone, your watches, every other timepiece on earth is calibrated to the movement of the sun and the moon and the stars? What is a second? How do you define that more scientifically? Well, it's the amount of time that it takes for light to travel 186,000 miles. That's how you know what a second is. Amazing stuff that's built into the universe itself. So we can step outside and so I'm told there can be some spectacular starscapes here in Hawaii. At least this time around, there's been too much cloud fuzziness to have one of those really spectacular ones. But I've been in other places where stars have been spectacular. I've been in big sky country of Montana. I've been in northern Arizona at high altitude and no light pollution. And you just look up at the stars and you're blown away that the God who created all of this vastness cares about me and what I did today and in what I might, by his power, be able to do tomorrow. He cares. Yeah. The God of creation is the God of relationships. So he put all those galaxies up there, all those stars, not just as ceiling ornaments for us, but rather so that we knew how to plan our daytimers, our Outlook calendars, our Google calendars, whatever it might be, whatever app you use. We know what time it is because God, from the very first chapter of Genesis, planned it out so that we could know when we have a date with God. You don't want to blow off a date with God, do you? That would be in bad taste, at the very least, right? Okay. Again, any thoughts here? All right, let me keep going. So God created humankind. It's how I'm translating it here. It's simply Adam. Adam or man, but I want to be gender inclusive here. God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he did create it, humanity. As male and female, he created them. So why do I want to translate that as gender inclusive? Because that's exactly what the text is saying. Male and female, who together reflect the image of God more completely than either gender on its own. The God of creation is the God of covenant. Do you realize that God doesn't have to keep the 10 Commandments? Because the second commandment is, you shall not make any images of me. Why? He already did it. Look around this room, and you are beholding the image of God in the other people that you see. If you were ever playing the game Pictionary, and you drew a card that said God, you might not only feel very, very inadequate and undereducated, but nowhere near talented enough to draw whatever might come to your mind with God. So let me help you out here. Just draw a picture of one of the other people at the table that you're sitting at with. That's the image of God. He did it. Male and female. He created them in his image. Okay? The God of covenant is the God of creation. No. You don't make images of me. I've already made an image of me. And all of us are it. Problem is, through the poor decisions that we have made all the way through our lives, we've marred that image. We have vandalized his artsmanship. a defaced painting or sculpture. What can be done about that? Some good news. When Jesus comes, we read in Colossians chapter 1, he is the image of the invisible God, that in him, that is in his flesh, Jesus' dwells all the fullness of the Godhead in bodily form. Jesus was the perfect, living, walking image of God. Now, I have some good news for you. We are in Christ if we're followers of Jesus. Mind-blowing concept. Because all of this marring and defacing that I managed to accomplish in this outward jar of clay still cannot keep the glory from within from shining through as we recognize our identity in Christ. Paul is just filled with this concept when he says, I am crucified with Christ. Yet not I, but Christ who dwells in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me. And he gave himself for me. Not vandalized junk, but redeemable image of God to show his holiness. Right? Wow, I feel like we should just call it a night right there and let us ponder that the rest of the evening. But unfortunately, I have some more points to make. So what's the big idea here? Where have I been going for this last amount of time? The God of creation in the beginning, Bereshit, is the God of covenant, Brit. So as I look at Genesis chapter 1, there's some other things that emerge that I think are very significant and noteworthy. Genesis 1 teaches us that he wants relationship with us. That everything was designed for relationship with us. From the stars through all of the plant life, the ocean life, every scene that you can envision, even at the microscopic level, right down to analyzing a DNA strand. All of it is pointing toward the fact that he wants us to enter into relationship with him such that we get blessed. Genesis 1 teaches us that God's creation shows us he's good and he loves beauty. Even God, at the end of each day, kind of steps back from his artistic work and he says, that's good. And by the way, what better art critic could you have than God himself, even if he's the artist? Day 2, oh, that's good. Right on through all of creation. Until he comes to the very end, and he makes Adam, and he says, no, that's not good. That man should be alone. I will make someone to be his partner. And then he says, and it was very good. All right? Because creation is good, he must be good. Because the artist is always greater than his or her artwork. God's creation shows us he's powerful. and not to be messed with. Because creation is powerful, he is powerful. I don't know what comes to your mind when you think of power in creation. My wife and I have been at the Oregon coast when on the morning after a big storm of the previous night, the waves are huge and sending spray up probably 120 feet in the air as they pound the rocks. And water rushes into these caves, and you hear the boom. It seems like it's just barely above subsonic. It's so low, but so loud. I can remember as a kid growing up in Waco, Texas, sitting out on our front porch and watching the sheet lightning light up the sky from one horizon to the other, and the booming and crashing and all of that. And I've never, ever seen a 4th of July fireworks display that even begins to look like that. And I was only 150 miles away or so when Mount St. Helens blew her top. And we could hear the sound 150 miles away. And that was an hour or two before all the ash started falling inches deep in eastern Washington, where we lived at the time. I'm sure every one of you can probably recall stories of encountering the power of creation. But however much power is in creation, according to Colossians 1, everything is held together in Christ. He's in charge of every atom, every subatomic particle. Creation itself is powerful. God must be infinitely more powerful to infuse it with that kind of power. God's creation shows us, man, he's smart. He's wise. And I have to confess, this appeals to me as someone who is definitely left brain, if not borderline OCD. He loves order. Right? I keep things in order, not only in my own head and on my computer files and things like that, but I just like the world around me to be in order. I realize not all of you are like that. That's driven home to me every single day because I married someone who is, by her own description, random abstract. Okay? I think that's the unwritten law of the universe that you have to marry somebody opposite you as far as that goes, right? But there are incredible patterns. So you see the little, the sunflower up there. And the patterns that go outward from that center. And there's even a formula for that called the Fibonacci sequence. I'm seeing some heads nodding. You're familiar with it. So that you can calculate where the placement of the next seed would be in that sunflower. But the Fibonacci sequence is identical in the shell of a sea creature. And did you know that the Fibonacci sequence is exactly the same formula that you would use to see the arms of a spiral galaxy? Incredible, isn't it? And it's all throughout the different levels of the microcosmic world to the macrocosmic universe. God loves order. Because creation is intricate and orderly. He's wise. Genesis 1 and 2 also teaches us that Yahweh, the name of God, that Yahweh rules over everything. And here's another mind-boggling thing. He doesn't want to hoard his whole kingdom to himself. But instead, he wants to put us in charge. I mean, does he know us? Well, yeah, he did make us, so I guess he would. But he's such a good craftsman that he can even rule the world through people who are very broken. Do we do it well? All of us collectively, I'm sure, can strive to do better. And we have much to learn. And by the way, just another little aside. Western civilizations have notoriously been bad about thinking about the land and our stewardship responsibilities toward it. Most systematic theology books, which are supposed to tell you God's truth about all the major categories, things like a doctrine of God, the doctrine of Jesus, the doctrine of the Scriptures, the doctrine of the church. One thing that's been absent for centuries from any of those systematic theologies is the doctrine of the land. It's a very biblical concept, and maybe because we in the West have not had a theology of the land, maybe that's part of why we have created such ecological devastation that we have. I'm glad that there are some who are finally really seriously attending to this, not only from a scientific point of view, but now from a biblical vantage point as well. It took us a few hundred years to come to our senses on that. God invites us to share with him. I don't know why. I do know, however, what it's like to have 2 grandkids, ages 2 and 4 approximately, help me to build a picnic bench. All right. Obviously, in the electric drill that I give to my grandkids, there's no bit in it. But they sure have fun with pulling that trigger and helping Grandpa. All right? It makes their day. They just love doing work with me, whatever that might be. And God has invited us to do work with his creation. And I'm sure that there are angels up in heaven who are slapping their foreheads and saying, oy vey, at some of our work. Kind of like when our own kids, when they were preschool levels and slightly older than that, they would go into the garden that she has worked so hard on and pick some of her flowers to give to her. How do you respond to that? Oh, honey, that's beautiful. And you turn away while you sniff. I wonder if there's some element of that. God has chosen to use us. Let me take this just one step further at a church level. I'm in amazement at what I see in Ephesians chapter 3. When we read that God has exhibited his wisdom, he makes manifest his wisdom through us, i.e. the church. I can scratch my head and say, all right, I can see how the church exhibits God's patience, his forgiveness, but his wisdom? I mean, has he ever attended my church? Well, yeah, he is so great and so small and so big simultaneously that he can use small people to do big things. If there's someone who is a very, very skilled woodworker, and they are able to make beautiful works of art with the medium of wood, that kind of a craftsman knows the value of good tools. But suppose there was a craftsman who was so good that he could turn out that kind of beautiful artwork using play school kids' toys. That would have to be a super master craftsman. Welcome to the church. We are the tools in his hands. And however much we get confused sometimes and misguided with our own selfish ambitions and mixed motives and everything else, the gates of hell itself cannot prevail against what God does for the church. That's to be excited about. That's how great God is. He's smart. He's way smart. Any questions, thoughts? Okay. I'll keep going. All of creation then serves to remind us that we were made for a relationship with God. And yes, if you think that looks a little bit familiar, this is from Kauai. Right? But all of creation everywhere is supposed to remind us, oh yeah, the reason that that's there, the reason that the sun came up today is not just for photosynthesis in the plants. It's to remind me that I've got a date with God. And I've got a date with his people. And my date with his people is tomorrow morning for many people. Right? Sunday services. So, kind of tying this all up, the God of the entire cosmos wants a relationship with us. And the sun and the moon and the stars are servants of his to remind us of this truth. And the heavens and all the land are to remind us that God wants a relationship with us. And all of this has been given to us collectively as humanity to caretake for him. My wife she grew up on a farm, and she loves gardening and studying about plants, and was doing so even just this afternoon on the way to church here. She was identifying plants and so forth. But there's something transcendent even in putting your hands into the soil, planting seeds, and there's not a thing that you can do on your own part to make that seed grow, to make it germinate. All you can do is maybe give it some fertilizer, prepare the soil as best you can, but it's a workmanship of God. And it's a way of partnering with God as your hands are getting all dirty, partnering with God in bringing forth beauty to his earth. And all the people that you come into contact with, they are images of God. And our role here is not to say, well, you're only imaging God, 17%, whereas this person over here is imaging God 53%. It's not about that. We're all made to image him And as we live in him, we have both the wisdom and the strength to walk more like Christ, and so have our faces transformed into the very visage of Christ. Jonathan Edwards, a theologian of a couple centuries ago, wrote, "The great and universal end of God's creating the world was to communicate himself. God is a communicative being. No wonder he self-identifies in John 1 as the Word. No wonder he speaks things into existence instead of just forming them with his hands. Humanity he does uniquely with his hand, but everything else is just spoken into existence. And the word appears hundreds of times in the Bible. The word came through the prophets saying, and God speaks. Hebrews 1 starts off many times, many ways in the past. God spoke to our fathers, but he has now spoken through his Son. All right, that was point number 1. The God of creation is the God of the covenant. Point number 2. God has made promises to Israel through the covenants. We're supposed to follow through on what we say to people in a way that shows that we have integrity, right? Sermon on the Mount, let your yes be yes, your no be no. Right? There's dependability and faithfulness that is exhibited when we tell the truth. We become trustworthy by being first truth-worthy. Okay? So simply saying something to someone else, they should be able to trust us to the degree that we have not failed them, that we've not double-crossed them or deceived them in any way. Okay? But suppose you really want people to be convinced that what you're saying is the truth. We might even say, I swear it's the truth. And I realize what the Sermon on the Mount says about swearing. But I'm just using the common language that we use in society. But suppose you really, really, really wanted to convince somebody. And you say, I'll put it in writing. I'll sign it. That would probably be maybe as high of a guarantee as we could possibly give someone. I not only say it with my mouth, but I'm putting it in writing. God has made promises to Israel in writing through covenants. He made a covenant with Noah, Genesis chapter 9. He made a covenant with Abraham. A promise made in chapter 12. The covenant made in chapter 15. Reiterated and ratified in chapter 17. He made a covenant with the Israelites there at Sinai. So let me just make a couple comments about covenants. It's not a real common word in the English language. We don't typically speak of covenants. Probably the closest that we approximate with this is contracts. So you enter into a contract with somebody and you will pay them X amount of money by such and such a time, while the person being contracted agrees to fulfill this and this and this in exchange for the monies given. And there's all kinds of details that might need to be hashed out. So some contracts are very detailed and complicated. That would be very similar to what we have with a covenant, but it's still not a very good analogy, because you can hire someone using a contract who's just really, really good at what they do, but you don't like them as a person. You don't have to like them as a person, as long as they do the job well, right? The covenants that God makes with people are not like covenants from the ancient Near East, because the covenants that were made back in biblical times never had a mandate that you had to love the other party. And yet that's exactly what we find in the biblical covenants, that there's a commitment to fidelity in relationship. So really, a better illustration would be today a marriage oath, taking our vows. And I realize that almost none of the young people, students and so forth, who approach me and ask if I might perform their wedding ceremony really have much of a concept of covenant at all when they're first talking with, actually we do it together as a couple, we meet together with them. But I spend quite a bit of time talking about covenants. And what we're doing as we make this promise is not just promising to this other person, but we're promising to live and to love and to remain faithful for a lifetime. And the vows that we make, typically it's not till hard circumstances come along. That's not part of the vows that we recite. But we say in sickness and in health, in riches, for richer, for poorer. We have a whole formula really to cover all contingencies. And so we're telling this other person, you can trust me when I say that I am in this relationship permanently. You can count on it. But that probably doesn't have enough accountability built into it. So what we do is we invite everyone of significance in our lives, from family and friends, to witness what we say when we say, I'm in this to be faithful for life. And if that's not enough, we also have to sign a paper for the state saying that we are now in marital relationship. And it is authorized by a certificate, a wedding license to be married. And if that's not enough, at least at Christian weddings, many couples will have as part of their service, somewhere in there, a prayer where God himself is the witness to a promise made between two people. Now, I realize that I might be messing with live exposed nerves here, but I don't know your story, so I can say this from a position of unfamiliarity. Whenever we decide to renege on that promise, and we say, in effect, Well, I said I would stay with you for a lifetime, but I've changed my mind. We've not just lied to the person that we're talking to directly, but we've lied in front of every people, all the people who are of significance in our lives. We've lied before the state, not that the state cares much about what we do, but we've also lied even in the witness of God. That's pretty serious, isn't it? I don't even know how you would go about making up for that kind of, slip up? How do you get someone ever to trust you about anything? Again, if you are willing to lie under these kind of circumstances. Now, I have had enough pastoral experience to realize there are some tragic situations. And sometimes people's lives, literally, are jeopardized by staying in a relationship. Those are awful situations. But no wonder God in Malachi says, I hate divorce. Because this is the closest kind of relationship that we have in reflecting God's own character. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother, be united to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This is a profound mystery. Amen? But I'm talking about Christ in the church. I've just quoted to you directly from Ephesians, and I didn't add any verses there that aren't already right there in the text. Our marriages are to say, this is what Christ in the church is like. Church isn't supposed to abandon Christ. They would not even be Christians. And Christ has already said, I will never, 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 never leave you or forsake you. All right. So I had an Old Testament prof when I was going through graduate school. And had him for Old Testament theology, a brilliant man and a godly, godly person. He came to the Portland area a number of years later after my wife and I were married and had some kids. And I had told my wife about this guy, Bruce Walke, for many years. Well, he came to the Portland area, and I said, honey, I'll stay and watch the kids. I've had a chance to sit under Bruce Walke. You need a turn. And she heard him talking on the book of Proverbs, and he got off topic a little bit at one point. And he said this, we are never more like God than when we are making and keeping covenants. It's what God does. But we are never less like God than when we are breaking covenants. And so when couples come over for some premarital counseling, they don't come out of our house bubbling with joy after this particular, because it's a really sobering thing. And all right, I'll be blunt with you here because again, I don't know the stories for many of you, but I'm not a big fan of humor at weddings because of the seriousness of a covenant. I don't think anybody was laughing when God made a covenant with Noah, with Abraham, and with all the Israelites, and with David. And when Jesus was talking about the establishment of a new covenant in the upper room. Now, tell your jokes all you want. I love funny things. But let's do it at the reception, where we can really celebrate. But the wedding itself, we just don't give it enough gravity, weight, the understanding of what it is that we're actually entering into. Okay. Okay. Any thoughts, feedback, or questions here? This is heavy stuff, I realize. Anyone? Tamara? Zach?
Thank you. Did God make a covenant with Adam?
Did God make a covenant with Adam or with humanity? And actually, there are whole theological systems that start off with the idea that God began with a covenant with Adam. And they even find maybe a passing proof text for that in Hosea. But I don't see the term Brit used in the early chapters of Genesis. So I'm not gonna hit the pulpit on that one. I don't even know if I'm gonna tap on it with my finger, because I just don't see it in the text itself. Good question. Others? Yes, Mike. Zach?
I just find it amazing where you're saying that the divorce rate. And my parents been their late 80s, and they've been married 60 years, and that's just such a rare thing. And just what you're saying, it's divorce is common, and it's kind of expected.
Yeah.
In a way, that's all.
Yeah, and that's where I mentioned that everybody reflects the image of God. Each one of us has vandalized it in some ways throughout our lives. But I know of couples who are not committed to following Christ, but who I think are very much imaging God by the fidelity to their marriages. I don't know how they do it without Jesus, but they've done it, and I would commend them for that. Yeah, it's a beautiful thing. Someone else? Okay. Let's keep going. God's covenant indicates a family relationship. We read a number of times in the Bible, I will be their God, or I will be your God, and they or you will be my people. I think I got a new insight into this just through a couple of experiences that drove it home. One of them was, I think I might have mentioned this, when I preached here like 2 years ago. I was at a church back in the Tri-Cities, Eastern Washington, a number of years ago before I started as a professor at Multnomah. And in our relatively small church, we started having bikers coming. And I ended up kind of being involved in this Christian biker gang that attended our church, not as a kind of bona fide biker member myself. I lacked a Harley. But they just began including me in as one of their own. And when you get hugged by a biker, you know you've been hugged. All right? Being included into family, they call each other brothers all the time. But to be included in their own terminology as a brother was actually, to me, a real honor. I felt special to be close enough to them to be able to enter into some of their world and know that it was with safety. Because I had a whole bunch of guys with flying colors on their back, their patches. And they had my 6. They take care of me. They were my people. I was one of them. At our church back in Portland, we have a young lady there who preaches from time to time. Annie can tell you all kinds of stories. They're best friends. Okay, Claire Marie, and she comes from a little town called Fallon, Nevada. Okay, I don't even know if it has a street light, but it's small. And when she got married, she married a guy who was actually originally from Pennsylvania. And there were people from Pennsylvania. There were lots and lots of people from Portland. Annie was there from Hawaii. And then there were the Fallon people. And you could just see them. They had sort of an air about them that said rural Nevada. Okay? And as Claire Marie was actually preaching in our church at a later time, she started telling just about a few stories about growing up in that church and just the behaviors of some of the people there. And she said, but they're my people. She identified, she at least understood, these are my kind of people. And this passage hit me in an altogether new way. God looks at us and he says, yeah, they're with me. Those are my people. That's my family. Mind-boggling concept. And we can call him Abba, Daddy. An intimate word. And Jesus even says that we can call him brother. You thought you had an older brother who was a know-it-all? Well, he's an older brother who really knows it all. Right? But he was natural born. Actually, that's maybe not the right term. He's a supernatural born. He was a bio kid. All the rest of us are adoptive kids. And in our adoption system, and I realize that there's variation from state to state to state, but somewhere implicit in all of that paperwork is, and this child will be my people. And I will be the parent. Right? That to me is just an amazing concept that actually comes out of the book of Genesis. We're not just reading ancient stories about people whose names we can't pronounce in a country that seems so far removed from a lifestyle of our own. This is talking about very, very practical ways of understanding who we are and how we're supposed to relate to other people and the rest of the world, and especially to our Abba, to our Daddy. In Ruth, she's Moabite. Moabites have been persecutors of Israelites for many, many years. She comes from the land of the enemy. And now she's brought into a little rural town called Bethlehem. What kind of a reception is she going to get? Naomi, who ran away to another country during a famine. Does this sound familiar? She's in Moab. She finally comes to her senses 10 years after she first ran away with her husband, Lamech. She finally comes to her senses, comes back, and Naomi says, no, you just stay here. My people don't treat your people well. And Ruth says to her, your people will be my people. Your God, my God. And if you stop and think about it, Ruth is showing more allegiance to the God of his chosen people than Naomi did, her mother-in-law. Third big point. Israel's failure to experience God's promises is due to a long track record of sinful failure. Why did Israelite history play out so miserably? Reads like a tragedy. Why was it so bad? And it wasn't because it was a bad covenant, but because the people themselves failed in fidelity, in being faithful to that covenant. The failure is not in the covenant itself, but in the people themselves. And point number 4, wow, got through number 3 pretty quickly, huh? Number 4, God's promises remain certain in spite of Israel's failure. The end of the story is not human rebellion, but God's desire to bless. Okay? God's promises aren't going to go away just because he had to go through all 5 of those steps of discipline before he finally got their attention. All right, let me launch off in a completely different direction here, but before I do, let me just pause here for a moment. Any questions, comments, or thoughts?
Ray, could you please repeat the third point? I'm taking notes, and I just wanted to...
Sure. Let me see if I can go back. Here we go. Third point is Israel's failure to experience God's promises is due to a long track record of sinful failure. Okay. Other questions or thoughts? Okay. So, who's the author of the Pentateuch? I think most of us from conservative churches all recognize that Moses is the author of the Pentateuch. But actually, why should we think that? Genesis 1 does not start off, I, Moses, a prophet and a priest of God, to the 12 tribes which are mumbling and groaning and griping all around me for the last 40 years. That's not how it starts off. Well, why do we think that it's Moses? And there's actually some reasons from the text that would seem to indicate that Moses is the author. So, for instance, in Exodus 17, we read, "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Write this on a scroll as something to be remembered, and make sure that Joshua hears it, because I will completely blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven.'" Okay? Are you convinced now that Moses wrote the Pentateuch? Well, not quite, right? He wrote down something, and he wrote it on a scroll. Right? At least minimally, you can say that. Especially when we see in chapter 24, verse 4, Moses wrote down everything the Lord had said. All right. So we know that he was an author of a scroll. All right, in Exodus 34, it says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Write down these words. For in accordance with these words, I have made a covenant with you and with Israel.' Moses wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, the 10 Commandments." Now are you convinced that Moses wrote the Pentateuch? Well, no, because all this really says is that he wrote the 10 Commandments. Right? How about Numbers? Here are the stages in the journey of the Israelites when they came out of Egypt by divisions under the leadership of Moses and Aaron. At Yahweh's command, Moses recorded the stages in their journey. This is their journey by stages. The book of Numbers is a travel log. Does this convince you that the Pentateuch is written by Moses? Well, maybe he at least is the author of most all of the book of Numbers. Okay, will you grant me that? Okay. In Deuteronomy 31, it says, "So Moses wrote down this law," this Torah, "and he gave it to the priests, the sons of Levi, who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and to all the elders of Israel." So he's writing down this Torah. Now are you convinced that he wrote the Pentateuch? Getting a lot closer, right? Although, did he write verse 9? So Moses wrote down. All right. This is making my head hurt a little bit here. Let's keep going. "So Moses wrote down this song that day and taught it to the Israelites." And we have all of chapter 32, which is a long chapter. It's a lengthy song. Moses wrote down the words to this song. Now are you convinced that he wrote the Pentateuch? Well, I'm convinced that he wrote another part of it. All right? He wrote this song. We're going to take a look at it later. After Moses finished writing in a book the words of this Torah, this law, from beginning to end, he gave this command to the Levites who carried the ark of the covenant of Yahweh. "Take this book of the Torah, place it beside the ark of the covenant of Yahweh your God. There it will remain as a witness against you." Now are you convinced? From beginning to end. It's Mosaic. Okay. And in 2 Chronicles, we read, Hilkiah, the priest, found the book of the Torah of Yahweh that had been given through Moses. So now we have somebody hundreds of years later who says, what we've had all this time in the ark of in this ark has been the very words of Moses. Now you're convinced he wrote the Pentateuch, right? And, oh yeah, by the way, in the other testament, you know, the last 1/4 of your Bible, we read, Jesus replied, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. Okay, so he's attributing it to Moses. Oh, and who's speaking, by the way, here? Jesus. Do you think Jesus knew the answer to this one? Okay. Or in Luke 16, he said to him, if they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be convinced even if someone rises from the dead. Moses and the prophets, first two big sections of the whole Bible. And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he, Jesus, explained to them, these are the disciples on the road to Emmaus, right after his resurrection. He explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself, beginning with Moses, okay, and the prophets. Now are you convinced? 3 times Jesus has told us. Okay. And in Luke 24, the same chapter, a little bit further, he, Jesus, said to them, this is the disciples. This is what I told you while I was still with you. Everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the Torah, the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms. The Psalms is the first book of that third section of the Hebrew Bible. John chapter 5. If you believe Moses, you'd believe me, for he wrote about me. Clearly, Jesus thinks that Moses is an author. Has not Moses given you the law? Yet not one of you keeps the law. Why are you trying to kill me? Later books in the Hebrew Bible refer to the Torah as a single book, not 5 separate plural books. So, for instance, in 2 Chronicles 25, in accordance with what is written in the law, the book of Moses, as if it's a single volume. Nehemiah 8. They told Ezra the scribe to bring out the book of the law of Moses. Exodus and Deuteronomy are simply referred to as the book of Moses in Mark and in Nehemiah here. All right, but there's also some passages that also seem to suggest that maybe he isn't the author of at least the whole thing. In Genesis 14, this is where we have the 5 kings against the 4 kings plus Melchizedek. Remember that? When Abram heard that relative had been taken captive, he called out the 318 trained men born in his household, and he went in pursuit as far as Dan. Why is that a problem? Abram's son is Isaac. Isaac's son is Jacob. Jacob has a number of sons, one of whom is named Dan. And Dan wasn't actually given a portion of land until the latter half of the book of Joshua. Here back in Genesis, these guys are being pursued as far as the land of Dan, and Dan hasn't even lived yet, much less had land. This makes sense to people who are reading it from a later point of view. Oh, Dan, that's way up north there. Okay? Or in Genesis 35, over her tomb, Jacob set up a pillar, and to this day, that pillar marks Rachel's tomb. Did Moses write that? Well, do you remember when Moses first entered into the land? No, you don't. But he did, actually. But not until the Mount of Transfiguration. Because during his own lifetime, he dies while still outside the land. How would he know about the pillar of Rachel when he'd never been there? Or these were the kings who reigned in Edom before any Israelite king reigned. The first king of Israel is whom? Saul. Hundreds of years after the lifetime of Moses. And yet we read here in Genesis that here's the kings who were in Edom even before there was an Israelite king, assuming that you know that there has been an Israelite king at the time at least verse 31 was written. Zach, can I get you to grab the mic? And run it up to Annie here.
I'm curious how that logic works, in that obviously Moses wasn't present for creation and things prior to him, like Abraham and such. So obviously Holy Spirit or inspiration informed him on those things to document. Why couldn't he potentially know things about the future and write about them, or places he hadn't been, like just the other kind of things?
Yeah, I think that in principle, we have to be open to that as a possibility. It seems like it would be a little bit of an odd way of writing. I mean, even if you were to say to the Israelites of that time, as he's writing the book of Genesis, where people who are now living under the covenant, they were pursued as far as the land of Dan. At least to the initial audience, that would go right past them. Other audiences later on could understand that. So it makes more sense that God would reveal all kinds of things about the past. I mean, how did he know? How did Moses know about the conversation that Yahweh had with Cain? Where's your brother? He wasn't around for that. Presumably, Adam and Eve weren't around for that. And I don't think this is by oral tradition. I think it's a miraculous, inspiring work by God to give him that information. So that's why, in principle, I have to be open to it. It just doesn't seem as likely. Go ahead.
Not to be argumentative,
But
I guess the next thing my brain does is, well, I think of the prophets who were showed a lot of things of the future to write down. So it's like we see him definitely giving future vision to many a man back in that time. So I guess I still logically, I mean, even past principally, yeah.
Yeah. I'll make a quick comment to that. I think it has everything to do with genre. That prophets are writing prophecy or perhaps apocalyptic, or in other ways let you know there's something future that's coming. And we're going to see that even in the Pentateuch, where Moses is clearly talking about the future. We saw it in the last session with Deuteronomy 30, when all these blessings and curses I have given come upon you, and you take them to heart wherever Yahweh your God may disperse you. Clearly, he's thinking way in the future. But there's nothing in the narrative that makes me think that we've just switched to the distant future. Okay. Great questions. Others? Okay. Continuing on this vein, to this day it is said, or it is called, which is used for a number of different places in particular. And then we have Numbers 12:3. Now Moses was a very humble man, more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth, if I do say so myself. That just seems like it'd be an odd verse. to write. It's kind of like self-defeating. As soon as you write it, you've disqualified yourself. So in my Bible, it's in parenthesis, but there's no such thing as parenthesis marks in Hebrew. Okay. But this is the real clincher, and that's the end of the whole Torah, Deuteronomy 34. And Moses, the servant of Yahweh, died there in Moab, as Yahweh had said. He, Yahweh, buried him, Moses, in the valley opposite Beit Peor, which is a terrible place, but keep going. But to this day, no one knows where his grave is. Moses was 120 years old when he died, yet his eyes were not weak or his strength gone. The Israelites grieved for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days until the time of weeping and mourning was over. Now Joshua, son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him. So the Israelites listened to him, Joshua. Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom Yahweh knew face to face, who did all those miraculous signs and wonders Yahweh sent him to do in Egypt. For no one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of all Israel. That does not sound like Moses is writing that, not even prophetically. And as I look at it, it seems like the vantage point is not just a few years later or Joshua, but now many, many years later, looking back and saying, guys, we've never had anybody as gifted as Moses, clear down to today. And so that makes me think that the whole ending of the book comes from many years later. How far later? I would actually be okay with seeing it as coming during captivity. And maybe even beyond when the prophets were silenced and we're not hearing any prophetic word. Okay? So I can see the last chapter being a very late addition onto substantially Mosaic work. So my bigger picture, and I'm just trying to lay all this out for you because you'll hear different people sometimes even get fights about the sources behind the Pentateuch. But in just a few minutes, I'm going to start showing you why that whole discussion doesn't matter. Okay. Other questions or thoughts here? Okay. Why would it not matter? Because there's some things that stitch the biblical account together so tightly that we have to acknowledge that even if Moses is not the author of the whole thing, somebody is. And I'll give you a clue. His name begins with a Y, a capital Y, a big capital Y, Yahweh. Okay. And I get this in part by looking at some of the literary patterns. So, you guys can now pull out your Bibles and let's start reading things closely and carefully here. Genesis chapter 1. And I've talked about Genesis 1 quite a bit already, but I want to bring out something else. So in the first part of this chapter, for the majority of this chapter, it reads mostly like narrative. Now I realize that there's some controversy as to whether or not it's narrative or poetry. My New International Version, and I don't use the NIV because I think that it is hands down the best English translation. I use it because more people that I talk to use the NIV than any other version. And I want to be on the same page, literally, as much as I can, okay? But my NIV has done something really, really, really curious. That is, whenever you're reading in narrative or in discourse, the first line of a paragraph is indented the same way that we do, right? And then the paragraph then goes out to the left-hand margin. But when it's poetry, my NIV center justifies it so that you have ragged edges on both sides, but the center point is the same for every line. It's poetry, okay? Well, what do they do with Genesis chapter 1? And you've got people who are potential customers who might want to buy your Bible. But if you give any implication that it is poetry, oh, the creation scientists are going to go off on you, and they're going to boycott your Bible, and there will be all kinds of flame mail on social media. Okay, so let's be safe and not do it as poetry. On the other hand, if you were to say that there's no real poetic vibe through this, and it was morning, and it was evening the first day. It was morning, it was evening the second day. And God said, and God said. And it was good, and it was good, and it was... That's not how a normal story works. So it has a poetry feel to it. So you know what my NIV translators did? They put the first line of each paragraph way out to the left and indented everything else. Because they're in the business of selling Bibles. And they don't want to lose potential customers. And they'll lay it out this way that looks like no other part of the Bible and let you decide for yourself. All right. They punted. But they didn't punt when it came down to verse 27. So God created Adam in his own image. In the image of God, he created him or it. Male and female, he created them. That just sounds like parallelism that you encounter in poetry. So much so that they center justified it. And following that, we have a little addendum. So, here it is right here. So it looks like this. You have narrative, and then a short block of poetry, and then a short section of epilogue. Genesis 1 through 26 is the narrative. The poetry is 127. The epilogue is 128 through chapter 2, verse 3. Now, there's nothing inspired about our chapter numbers and where they are placed. That wasn't part of the original text. Chapter divisions were put into our Bibles in the 1200s by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen Langton. And all things considered, I think that Steve actually did a pretty good job with his chapter divisions, but he blew it right out of the gate with his very first chapter division. 6 days of creation, chapter division. And on the seventh day, why not put the seventh day in with the other 6 days? There's other reasons for thinking that maybe those first few verses really belong with what's above. Okay. Let me just mention one. In the beginning, God, Elohim, created the heavens and the earth. All the way through this whole first block, it's always Elohim. It's never Yahweh. Starting in 2 verse 4, we have Yahweh Elohim. And it will continue to be Yahweh Elohim for the next 2 chapters, which is just further indication to me that this was an odd chapter break. But then again, Steve wasn't working with a Hebrew Bible. He was looking at a Latin Vulgate. Okay. All right, so we have a narrative and poetry and an epilogue. And this narrative starts with Bereshit. Okay. I don't expect you to remember the Hebrew. Just remember in beginning. Okay. And then what we have is chapter 2, in which I have a big block of narrative, followed by a single verse of poetry, down in verse 24. This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man. And then we have an epilogue. And in the epilogue is where we first read, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother, be united to his wife. Okay? So, imagine you're cruising along at 36,000 feet, and all of a sudden, you hit a zone of turbulence. Pilot comes on, or co-pilot, tells you to fasten your seat belts, and depending on how bad or how urgent this is, there might even be some further directions. All right? Whenever you're reading along in one particular style of literature in the Bible, and the pattern gets broken, pay special attention. You just hit turbulence. So here you are reading the narrative, and you're grooving along, reading narrative, and we interrupt this program for a special announcement, and it comes in poetry. And then there's an epilogue, and it turns out there's always something important in the epilogue. In the first epilogue, what's important is the 7th day. And in the second one, it's this indication of husband and wife being united together, quoted multiple times in the New Testament. So, in the narrative, you have the baseline. In the poetry and the epilogue is where we encounter what I call HDT, which stands for heavy-duty theology, right? Although one of my instructors working under me called it high definition. I think I might like that even better. High definition theology, really clean, crisp resolution when we come to a theological pronouncement. So we have story, but then we have a special announcement that requires our attention. And then we have an epilogue. Okay. Now, we've seen this in chapter 1. We've seen it in chapter 2. If you were to look at 1 through 3 as an entire literary unit, many scholars throughout all the centuries have seen Genesis 1 through 3 as a unit. You know what you would find? You would find 1:1 through 3:13 is predominantly narrative. Except for those little poetic insertions, 3 chapters of almost all narrative. But then we have an HDT section. We have poetry. And then we have an epilogue. So where do you think we're going to turn to look right now? We're going to go to the poetry. Is there anything important in the poetry of 3:14 through 19? Yahweh said to Yahweh Elohim the Lord God said to the serpent, because you have done this, and now we have poetry. Cursed are you above all the livestock and all the wild animals. You will crawl on your belly. You will eat dust all the days of your life. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head. You will crush his heel. It's the same verb. So you can have bruise or crush or whatever. But let me just go back to the first line, verse 15. I will put enmity. That's what my NIV says. When's the last time you used enmity in a sentence? Okay, like never. That's not even an English word anymore. What word do you think that we should use? What's that? Division, hostility, enemyship, if that's a word. I'm going to put strife, conflict. I'm going to put conflict between you, he's talking to the serpent, and the woman. Who's the woman? Eve. Between your offspring and hers. Is offspring, in English, is offspring a singular noun or a plural? How about seed? Singular or plural? Yeah, it can be either one. You can go down and buy a whole 50-pound bag of seed, and people will not think that you're grammatically wrong because you didn't say seeds, right? Or I can say, would you like to see a picture of my offspring? And I can show you a picture of my son or my daughter or our grandchildren or any one of them or all of them together. And it would be correct grammatically to say offspring or seed. So it is here. I will put hostility between your offspring, talking to the serpent, and her offspring. Does this mean all of her offspring or one particular offspring? He, singular, will crush your head. Some seed of the woman is going to crush the serpent's head. And you will crush his heel. One of these is clearly fatal. Right? The crushing of the head. We have here actually what theologians have sometimes referred to as the proto-evangelium, the first announcement of the gospel. Important stuff? Absolutely. Especially right after the fall. Their separation from God is now going to be reversed. And isn't it kind of odd that the announcement of the gospel first comes to the serpent? But he draws the lines very clearly. This is a foregone conclusion. You've already lost the battle. You think you won at the tree? No, you just brought upon yourself the end. But we keep reading because it's still poetry. To the woman he said, I will greatly increase your pains in childbearing. With pain you will give birth to children. I don't know what change took place then. As a male, I'm not even going to try and speculate about anything. I will greatly increase your pains in childbearing. With pain you will give birth to children. Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. It's been taken a number of different ways. I certainly don't take it in the sense of, women, you just can't help yourselves. You're going to fall in love with some guy. No. That's not what it's saying. I think it really is kind of pointing to, you will desire to dominate your husband. The same word here for your desire, you see in the next chapter with Cain and Abel. And sin is crouching at your door and desires to have you. I think this has more to do with wresting of power, control over the other person. And he will do the same. He will seek to domineer over you. And so we have a conflicted relationship between the sexes that come out of this fall. And out of the two, she ends up being more victimized than he. And pretty much all of human history has just underscored the devastation that has been. Okay. Verse 17. To Adam he said, because you listened to your wife and ate from the tree about which I commanded you, you must not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. Cursed is the Adamah. Remember when I said that Adam was formed from the Adamah? Now the Adamah has been despoiled in some way. It's been cursed. Through painful toil you will eat of it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow you will eat your food, until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken. For dust you are, and to dust you will return. Important announcement, right? There's hope, and it's anticipating the future. And then we have a little epilogue. And what do we see in the epilogue? God takes care of their need, not just for clothing, but for covering of their shame. But he also banishes them. Kind of like in exile. And we've all lived in exile away from the Garden of Eden. Or as the text even says later on, east of Eden. Which, I don't know, sounds like it would be a good name for a John Steinbeck novel. Very depressing novel, by the way. I prefer the Bible. All right, so they're banished. They're sent into exile. Right? Now let's keep on going a little bit more. What do you suppose is going to happen in chapter 4? Go ahead, just pretend that you're a prophet. What kind of literary pattern do you think you're going to find? Narrative, poetry, epilogue, and that's exactly what we have. So we have a narrative. The poetry is Cain's son, Lamech, ends up killing someone as well. He's like his father as being a murderer. But God put his hand of protection really on Cain, though he was banished. How about when Lamech does it? Lamech said to his wives, Adah and Zillah, listen to me. Wives of Lamech, Hear my words. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. Oh, man. This story has really gotten really sour pretty quickly in the space of 2 chapters. But, and it leads us really to a crisis. The woman is going to have a seed, right? And the defeat of Satan, the defeat of the serpent, is going to come through the seed. Is the seed Cain? No, the guy's a murderer. Well, is the seed then Abel? Well, no, he's the one who got offed by Cain. So how is this prophecy ever going to come true? In the epilogue, we learned they had another kid, and his name is Seth. Now, what happens in Genesis chapter 5? It's not narrative and poetry and epilogue. Instead, it's a genealogy. And we roll our eyes and wonder what it's doing in the Bible. But what it's telling us is that there is a line from generation to generation of the seed of the woman. Now, why would I think that this is someone who is of the godly line rather than an ungodly line? Because of the intro to the genealogy. Chapter 5 starts off. This is the account of Adam's line. When God created Adam, he made him in the likeness of God. He created them male and females, quoting an earlier passage here, and blessed them. When they were created, he called them Adam. When Adam, and in this case I take it to be Adam, when Adam had lived 130 years, he had a son in his own likeness, in his own image, and he named him Seth. God has an offspring, Adam. Adam now has an offspring who is in his own image, in the same way that Adam was created in God's own image. The godly image is passed on. Questions or comments or thoughts here? Zach?
So you know how you tell us to, when the pattern changes, to like pay attention, it's that turbulence. I know you jokingly said, here's a genealogy, and we all kind of yawn and wonder why it's there, but it's also breaking the pattern. So is this kind of this pay attention to this section right here, this genealogy in particular?
Yes. Yeah, which is exactly where we tend to zone out because of the genealogy, for Pete's sake. When in reality, we're seeing that God is preserving the line. And what we're seeing here is one baby announcement after another baby announcement. And baby announcements are not bad things, and they're not boring. Even if we don't remember all the details of, their weight and their height and their length and all that kind of stuff, it's good news. This is good news. The godly line is being preserved. Great. Anyone else? Okay, so yes, Genesis chapter 5 is a major pattern breaker. But rather than tune it out or skip over it, skim through it, what we need to do is actually realize that it is communicating something important theologically. Now, let me just finish with one last illustration here. There's a book that I carry with me in my backpack and take it to class frequently when I'm teaching Old Testament classes that have genealogies in them. Because I know that genealogies are hard for all of us to read. But the name of the book is a children's book, and it's called God's Special Baby. And it's written for children about the birth of babies in the Bible. And the first time or two, I actually read through the book. But from there on out, it was just a game that I would play with the kids. And I would point to the pictures and I would say, who's this? Papa Adam. Who's this? Mama Eve. Who's this? Baby Cain, baby Abel. And I would say, is this God's special baby? No. Who's this? Papa Abraham. Who's this? Mama Sarah. Who's this? Baby Isaac. Is this God's special baby? No. Who's this? Papa Jacob. There was only a picture of the dad on this one, which was good, because there's 4 moms at different parts of the story. It just showed Jacob. Who's this? Papa Jacob. Who's this? Baby Joseph. You could tell that even in a black and white book, there were stripes all over his robe. So you knew it was baby Joseph. Is this God's special baby? No. Who's this? Mama? No. Yeah, who's this? Mama Hannah. And again, it doesn't show the dad there. It's Elkanah, but we can go there. Who's this? Mama Hannah. Who's this? Baby Samuel. Is this God's special baby? Who's this? Papa Jesse. Who's this? Baby. Is this God's special baby? Who's this? Papa Zechariah. Who's this? Mama Elizabeth. Who's this? Baby. Okay. Oh, there was one other in there. I'm going to go back and pick up on it. Who's this? Papa Amram. Who's this? Mama Jochebed. Who's this? Baby Moses. Yeah. And yes, my kids knew their names, all the names there. And then we finally come toward the end. Who's this? Mama Mary. Who's this? Angel Gabriel. Is he the papa? No. Who's this? Baby Jesus. Is he God's special baby? Yes! And they get so excited about it. That is how to read every genealogy in the Bible. You are looking for the baby to come. All the way from Genesis chapter 3 through the entire Hebrew Bible,